Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman, dear colleague. And yeah, it's a huge honor and pleasure for me to be here in front of you. Yeah, everything has already been said by Gustavo, and yeah, I'm here now in the delicate position to. Well, it's not that delicate, but to complement Gustavo's analysis of the French codification. Well, Gustavo was a little bit the bad cop of codification, so I can be the good cop of French codification. I hope that it does not give too much the impression of the lack of coherence in the French doctrine, as it was mentioned, because we are very eager about this dialogue. So I want to start by thanking, of course, the organizers, the Ferenc Mádl Institute and the Central European Academy. A special thank, of course, to Emmett as well, to Silvia and the entire staff, because it was really great welcome that we had here. So thank you very much for this. I will be continuing the discussion on the codification of civil law in France. And well, I will start with one first strong statement. Civil law in France is the Code Civil. Well, we have many indications for that, some strong statements. One by Jean Carbonnier, who clearly said the Code Civil, the Civil Code, is the civil constitution of France. And whereas the political constitutions have been changed so many times in France, there was at least a stability with regard to the civil constitution. In line with that, Napoleon's statement that the Code Civil is his achievement that no military defeat will erase also stands and still stands for the influence that Napoleon had on the French nation. And then, last element, the Code Civil is also lieu de mémoire, a site of memory. It's the site by which the presence of law, the presence of use, is guaranteed in the collective memory of the French people. And with those three statements, you can already see how attached the French society is to its civil code. And I see that as a foreign spectator or observer of this place of the French civil code, because I'm not French. So I try to understand here the perspective of the French with regard to their Code Civil. And well, we have many illustrations. If we think now about the last emblematic fights or evolutions with regard to societal problems, marriage, parenthood, new ways of establishing of procreation. Well, all those fights targeted also for having a recognition in the Code Civil, in the Civil Code. So the Civil Code has really a symbolic value that is very strong for the French society. But of course, not only for the French society, for French scholars, civil scholars, or civil law scholars, the Civil Code is also, of course, tremendously important. And well, there is some pride about the Civil Code, and we try to do our best to promote it, even though we are very much aware about the limitations of the codification. And the code also plays a very important role for the judge, and I will try to explain that a little bit more, but yeah, it's certainly at the heart also of the attention of the judge, at least when he intervenes in the field of civil law. But I will focus now a little bit on the most recent evolutions. So my position will be to see how the Civil Code evolved over the last 20 years. So we had the bicentenary in 2004, and I will focus on what happened after the bicentenary of the Civil Code. And it was quite clear in 2004 that the Civil Code was outdated by then. And of course, there were huge celebrations about the quality of the Civil Code, about the importance that this code had. But nonetheless, it was accepted that there is a major need for reform. And we can just take a couple of examples, but I will be faster. But tort law, which has not been reformed legislatively in the Civil Code, and some adaptations, yes, but very limited, and the heart of tort law, was left aside. And there was also an awareness about technical deficiencies of the Civil Code, and there was a report by the World Bank doing business that hurted a lot French scholars, because the conclusion of that report was to say, well, French law is completely inadequate for international commerce and trade, and therefore there was this awareness, okay, we have to maintain the attractivity of the French economy, and therefore we also need an attractive law, we need attractive legal rules. That was one of the aspects, and then on the other hand, there was this clear awareness about the need to adapt the code to social and economic realities and trends. So 2004, I think we can really say that, the code was praised as a monument of French law, but the need to reform it was quite clear, but it was also clear that if the code needed to be reformed, it was in order to maintain the central position of the Civil Code within the legal system. The Civil Code has to be the main instrument of reference in order to understand the French civil law. Now I will be relatively quick on some of the main drivers of the reforms that have taken place. I think you have some drivers that are internal pressure, because the French society evolves and therefore wants adaptations in its law. And on the other hand, you have external pressure, and this was quite strong for the French Civil Code. The scholars were aware about all the nice reforms that took place in other countries. And well, the German reform of the law of obligations was certainly a strong impetus for France to say, okay, if the Germans made a reform, okay, we also need to reform our Civil Code, because otherwise we will be lagging completely behind. And you also had the European project for unification, and the project for European Civil Code was accepted, was welcomed in France under the perspective, okay, if there is this pressure on the European level, we must reform our national code so that it becomes crystal clear that a European Civil Code is not acceptable. And there was really this strong opposition to the idea of a European Civil Code, and one of the best ways for fighting against the European Civil Code is to change the national code. And therefore, you cannot no longer say, okay, European is modern and national is outdated. The modern version of law was the French law. So that's why here there was this strong incentive to reform. But of course, reforming was not the only goal or the only objective. Reforming has to go along with conserving. We are lawyers after all, so we need to identify what in the code has to be kept and what needs to be reformed. And therefore, the reforms were really seen as a recodification, yes, but a recodification step by step. One of the difficult questions is whether there was a systemic view in terms of reforming the Civil Code. Certainly on some aspects, this approach was taken to say, okay, we must have a systemic approach to how we reform the code, but you also see in many fields that it was a sectoral approach that was taken, and just some changes were made, but without affecting the overall structure of the code. So I will try here to present a little bit those main reforms over the last 20 years, keeping an eye also on who were the actors of those reforms, because you have, of course, on the one hand, the legislator as one of the actors of the reform, but it was mentioned, the Superior Commission of Codification, well, that's a body of the government. And the government also played a quite important role in the reforms, because a lot of the reforms were adopted by ordinance of the government, including experts, and therefore the parliament was controlling what the government did, but left a lot of the operative parts to the government. And judges also played a very important role. I will try to explain it, of course not in modifying the code, but in modifying heavily how the code is to be applied. And yeah, with those in mind, I will, it will of course be just a very rapid overview about those evolutions, keeping an eye on the general structure of the French Civil Code, and focusing more deeply a little bit on the law of obligations, because for civil law, of course, this has a major place in civil law. So I will try here to explain how the evolutions over the last 20 years illustrate or confirm that the civil code in France is the civil constitution of France, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how the civil code is the foundation of the civil order of France. And here I make this distinction between civil constitution, the constitution of the society, and the civil order. For the civil order, I will focus more on the law of obligations, on the technical aspects, whereas the first element underlines really the overall importance of the code, not only for technical aspects, but also for those very societal, foundational aspects, such as what is marriage, what is parenthood. And I will give some illustrations here. So let's start with the illustration of the civil code as the civil constitution of France. And here, I will focus on two aspects. The first one, the general part of the civil code. It's only 6 articles, so it can be, rather quick. And for those 6 articles, where there was no legislative reform, almost none, but nonetheless, there was what I call a revolution in the way in which those articles are to be applied. And then for this, here my second subpart, and I will focus on now the law of persons and family law, which is the first part of the civil code, for which we can see that here we have a social evolution, or perhaps social revolutions, that call for a reform of the civil code. So this will be here the second aspect. I will start with the legal revolution without the legislative reform. First 6 articles of the civil code. Here we see the French approach to codification, very rational approach. The first 6 articles of the French civil code, they give the main rules as to what is a legal system in the French understanding of it. Article 1, when does the law enter into force? Article 2, what is the temporal scope of application of the law? Article 3, what is the territorial scope of application? Article 3 was the article for the entire private international law for almost 200 years. Article 4, the judge cannot refuse to render justice, prohibition of the denial of justice. Article 5, the judge can make no precedents. The judge cannot decide by general rules that will be binding for the future. Article 6, public policy is off the limits of party autonomy, or freedom of the parties. Those 6 articles, they provide for the general framework of what is civil law. But not only what is civil law, of what is law, what is the rule of law in the context of France. And it defines what is the power of the judge and what are the limits of the power of the judge. And those articles, they haven't changed. Article 1 did a little bit, because with the modernization, of course, electronic publication made a change in when the law can enter into force. But the others did not change, but the way in which they are applied changed dramatically. In 2004, there was still this huge debate of whether case law is a formal source of law, a source of normative rules. Nowadays, there is a consensus that case law in France is a normative source, that case law is among those sources of what is law, what is the use. And even the way in which judges apply the law changed dramatically, with the possibility for the judge to use a proportionality control and to set aside a law that in general is compatible with higher norms, but in one practical case does contradict it. So here, the duties and the powers of the judge have dramatically changed over the last 20 years, even though the civil code remained completely unchanged. This is in contrast now with what happened to the law of persons and family law, where here, there was no general reform of the civil code, but when we think about the social evolution in this context, of course, changes have been tremendous. marriage, with the opening of marriage to same-sex couples. What is parenthood? Procreation. You can also think about the law of persons, the protection of the human body after death. That's in the Civil Code. The protection of human dignity is not in the French Constitution, it's in the Civil Code. And all those elements, which are really crucial for ethical considerations in France, they are in the Civil Code. And there's an ongoing discussion as to how bioethical rules have to be reformed in France, and they also target at the Civil Code. Of course, the Civil Code does not provide for all rules, just the most fundamental ones, and then you need to check in other codes how those rules that are in the Civil Code are implemented. But nonetheless, those major social evolutions, they find a translation into the Civil Code. So here, the Civil Code is certainly a main element of reference for the French society, and therefore I argue that this idea that the Civil Code is the civil constitution of France still stands. But it's not only the civil constitution of France as a society that is based on the rule of law, that is a legal society in which you know that a judge will always be able to find a solution to your dispute. The Civil Code is also here the foundation of a civil order. And a civil order here really in the way of a law of obligations. The civil law is not only there in order to deal with those strongly social considerations, it's also there in order to provide for a framework for trade, for exchange, for economic relations, for which perhaps we don't really care who will win in the end, who will get 1,000 euros, but we must have legal certainty, we must have predictability. And here, the Civil Code also evolved, of course, tremendously, and I will just present the main reforms, which I think underline the idea that, yes, the Civil Code is catching up with evolving economic needs. But this is a movement that is still incomplete, and I will also show that the Civil Code is still lagging behind with some expected reforms. I'm sorry because I have to be very brief here on those aspects, but I will start with the catching up with modernity and with the economic needs. Of course, it has already been mentioned, the major reform in 2016 on contracts law, the general regime of obligations, and proof shows that here the French legal system really was eager to adapt in order to, well, be accessible, in order to be attractive. And, well, then when you take a closer look at it, for us as academics, well, it's absolutely comfortable. It's amazing. We can take that law, and with that law, well, we can explain what is contracts law in France. We start with a definition of what is a contract. Then we go on with freedom of contracts and its limit, public policy. We continue with pacta sunt servanda. After pacta sunt servanda, good faith. So we see here all the main principles, the guiding principles of what contracts law is based on, and we find them here very accessible in our code. So here we see that the French Civil Code, well, it's providing for those main concepts for argumentation. It's the main element of reference if you want to understand what is the vocabulary, what is the grammar you have to use, if you want to understand French law. And it's not limited to just the main principles, because really the idea is, well, you also have to be able to predict the outcome. The powers of the judges, they will be defined when the judge will have the possibility to adapt. And this is not only here with regard to the concept of obligation itself, it's really taking into account the practical needs, the practical importance of that civil law. And here's a strong illustration of that. Of course, you have on the one hand that the law of obligations, when it was reformed, included the rules on proof. And if you cannot prove your legal obligation, well, what is your legal obligation worth? So here, even this link between proof and the substance of the obligation is already underlining how important the practical consequences are. But on the other hand, if you now take the second major reform of the Civil Code, the reform on security interests, and guarantees, here you also see what matters in practice. It's not whether you have an obligation or not, it's whether you can get it executed or not, whether you can get it performed or not. What do you need if you want to be sure about your prospects of performance? Well, you need securities or you need guarantees. And they have been reformed now recently as really a necessary prolongation of the reform of the law of obligations. If you do not know how to secure your obligations, well, what will your obligations be worth? And here this idea of predictability shows that, well, French civil law over the last 20 years has understood that it needs to adapt, that if it wants to meet here the economic needs, the needs of the society under those economic considerations. But, there is a but, the civil code is still lagging behind with some major reforms. And so I will terminate with this perhaps more nuanced approach to what is still lacking to the recodification of the civil law in France. And here we have a couple of ongoing reform processes, reforms. You can think about tort law, which is a little bit a sea serpent of the French reform. We are always talking about the necessity to reform tort law in France. We have now the draft by the Senate. Whether it will really be achieved or not, it's quite doubtful. But judges deal with it, so it's not even that big an issue. Property law. There was also a proposal to change it, but well, it has not been changed. And of course, property law played an important role under the French Revolution, where you can say the civil code was based on liberty, freedom, equality, and property. That were the three main principles probably of the civil code after the French Revolution. And then you can think about two other reforms that are still ongoing, special contracts and private international law. But for both, the prospects are not that good, at least if they have to be seen as a systemic reform. There might be reforms, but they will probably be just sectoral reforms, because here is it because the practical importance is not strong enough or is too strong and therefore would require more attention than what could have been given? But we see that the process remains incomplete. So there can be some frustration with regard to how the French code adapts itself to the modern needs of civil law. But nonetheless, if I want to come here to a conclusion, I think that the last 20 years, they show that the Code Civil, the civil code, is a living instrument. It's not something that is petrified. It is capable of change. And here, this living instrument, it's really based on this balance that has to be found between conserving what needs to be conserved, what is worth of being conserved, and reforming. And here, this balance is implemented by the interplay of the legal actors. Legal actors, well, of course, you have the legislator, but you also have the government and the experts. You have the judges, who are one main actor of this legal evolution. And you have the practitioners. You have the citizens. We mentioned them. And all those together, they find the balance between conserving and reforming. And therefore, the code is not just a text. It's a method. And here it's a method that is really at the heart of the understanding and of the operation of civil law, at least in France, but I think more than that. And here the code, it's really the promise of a national society that is based on the respect of legal expectations that are respectful of fundamental social values. And here the last 2 decades confirm, with regard to the French civil code, that the civil code is a foundation of the society in France. And it's not only a monument of the French society. More than that, it's a structuring and dynamic pillar of the French nation and a legal model for the nations in general. And with it, let me terminate my ode to code. Longue vie au Code civil des Français. Long live the codification of civil law. Thank you for your attention.